You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back to the second hour of our program. Thom Hartmann here with you, brought to you in part by Chevrolet, because America deserves some credit. Qualified buyers can get low-rate financing on select 2008, 2009 Chevy models. The length of the contract is limited. See your dealer for details, and take delivery by 3/31/09. That's coming up soon. So I'm sitting on the plane day before yesterday, flying home from Los Angeles, and I pulled out a copy of The Economist that I'd bought a week or two earlier on another flight that I hadn't gotten around to reading yet. And the cover story is basically calling for the legalization of all drugs all over the world, because this week, or actually maybe it was last week, whatever, the week following the publication of that particular edition of The Economist, there was a big international meeting where all over, countries from all over the world were going to reconsider their drug policies. And so The Economist, it's a very conservative publication, business publication, is coming out and saying 20 years ago we said all drugs should be decriminalized. Now we're saying we can prove all drugs should be decriminalized. End of discussion. And they laid it out. And for example, one graph, this was particularly interesting, cocaine usage. Cocaine taking over the previous 12 months. This is from The Economist. Among young adults 15 to 34 years old. The countries with the most draconian laws against cocaine, the United States and Britain. Over 5% of young adults have tried cocaine in the previous 12 months. In France and the Netherlands, well, in the Netherlands in particular, where the laws are pretty much not enforced, and France, where they're kind of marginally enforced, it's more treated as a public health problem, about 1%. In other words, there's about a 500% increase in the usage of cocaine in those countries where it's illegal, where it's heavily illegal, and the laws are heavily enforced. It doesn't work. Jacob Sullum is with us. He is the senior editor for Reason magazine, the author of Saying Yes in Defense of Drug Use. And Jacob, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Reason magazine, the libertarian publication, right?
That's right.
And I've often described libertarians as Republicans who want to smoke dope and get laid. We're dealing with the smoke dope part of it. Why? My position on this has been that if it can grow in your backyard, the government should have no right to regulate or control it. But if it's made in a laboratory, or if it's made synthetically, then it's not a natural substance, and there is a good reason why we should collectively be looking out for our own welfare. And I'm not saying that we should be using the heavy criminal statutes against things like LSD, which is made in a lab, although you can get it in a raw state, a natural state, from morning glory seeds, heavenly blue morning glory seeds. But cocaine, but I think if you can grow coca leaf, there should be no problem. But if you're selling processed cocaine, that should be more like alcohol and tobacco. It should be regulated.
Well, I'm not sure I buy your distinction completely. I mean, obviously there's something to that in the sense that less processed drugs are generally less concentrated and in many cases raise fewer concerns than the more concentrated, more processed drugs.
Well, that's not the basis for my argument, Jacob, because if you try, Jimson...
Natural versus synthetic?
No, it's, for example, I mean, when I was a teenager back in the 60s, people were trying everything to get high, and I tried a few myself. And people were trying things like Jimson weed, which cattle would eat and go crazy. And right. It turns out the stuff is really, really toxic. I mean, you will get high from Jimson weed. You may also die. Belladonna. People were using, they were eating crab apples and deadly nightshade to get belladonna and scopolamine. You get very high, but the amount that gets you high is like maybe 5% less than the amount that kills you. So I'm not saying a natural substance, but I am saying that those natural substances, there's still, nobody's regulating Jimson weed, nobody's regulating crab apples or nightshade. For that matter, nightshade, belladonna is in the leaves of tomato plants, that's not being regulated. That if it grows, it's just silly for us to try to have the government regulating it. That's my point.
Well, you might think so. I mean, by the way, the things that you were citing, those are good examples of how prohibition drives people to crazy, dangerous lengths and actually makes drug use more dangerous.
Absolutely.
But in any case, I mean, you might think it's silly that the government can regulate what you can grow in your own backyard, but this was established by Supreme Court decisions back during the New Deal. And this is what FDR asserted, is that even if you grew food for your own consumption and never left your farm, the government could still regulate that, because the fact that you're eating your own food that you grow means that you're not buying it on the market, and that somehow indirectly affects interstate commerce. So that's the whole rationale behind federal drug prohibition right there, is that the federal government has the authority to tell you you can't grow marijuana on your windowsill or in your closet or in your backyard, because by consuming your own marijuana, even if you never sell it, even if it never crosses state lines, by consuming that means you're not buying it on the market. That affects interstate commerce in this illegal drug, marijuana, and therefore they have authority, and that's no joke.
Well, I think you're stretching it a little bit, because it goes back to the tax laws. They're saying that this stuff could be taxed, just like tobacco could be taxed.
That was the original rationale for the Marijuana Tax Act, which is why it has that name. But currently, the rationale for federal prohibition, which was just upheld by the Supreme Court in the cases involving medical marijuana, is precisely what I'm saying, that it's an exercise of Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce.
Yeah. And this is something that the regulation of interstate commerce was. There is this Commerce Clause in the Constitution which gives the federal government this one small opportunity to get their hand into business, into interstate business. And beyond that, everything was pretty much left to the states. The word corporation, for example, doesn't appear in the Constitution. And that was the rationale that Bobby Kennedy was using for pushing civil rights legislation. And Republicans, by and large, conservative Democrats as well, actually, in the House and Senate, were saying, hey, wait a minute, how is a locally owned lunch counter in Selma, Alabama, if it's not part of a nationwide chain, how is a locally owned lunch counter that's operating in a segregated fashion participating in interstate commerce? And the answer was, well, something, I guarantee you, something that they're selling at that lunch counter came from out of state.
Right. The potatoes for the French fries come from Idaho. No
that's
kidding.
right.
I mean,
that's right. And therefore, and it's a stretch. And I'll acknowledge that it's a stretch, but it was.
You should also realize that here you have, that's an example of an expansive view of the Commerce Clause being used in service of a progressive cause, right?
Right.
But we are now seeing how the same kind of argument is used against progressive causes, not just in the case of drug policy, where the federal government is coming into California and saying, no, you cannot let patients have marijuana, but also in the case of something like assisted suicide. Oregon and now Washington State have made it legal to obtain barbiturates for the purposes of killing yourself. If you're a terminal patient, you can get it from the prescription from a doctor, right? The federal government under Bush
tried to shut that down.
We don't want you to do that.
Yeah.
And our rationale is the Constitution gives us this authority to regulate.
But they lost.
Now, they get lost, but I would argue that the Supreme Court, in making that distinction, is completely unprincipled. On the one hand, they said medical marijuana, you can overrule the state policy. In the case of suicide, no. Yeah.
Well, I agree with you.
All the same basic rationale.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's irrational. And now also we've got, there's a lot of concern in the organic community now that there's legislation that's being pushed principally apparently at the urging of one of the big seed and agri-chemical companies that would further extend regulation of what you can grow in your backyard and how you can grow it and whether you can save seeds and all these other kind of things. But that we're wandering off from the issue of how to stop the drug wars, which was the title of the cover story on The Economist, or your article, Say Yes in Defense of Drug Use. Now, I'm not suggesting that. Well, actually, I will. I would say that humans have co-evolved with psychoactive plants, and it's in our nature to alter our consciousness. I believe that that's the case.
I agree.
And I think that's why we drink coffee. I think that's why we drink Coca-Cola, which has caffeine in it. It's why people smoke cigarettes, and it's why they smoke pot and everything else. How do we break through this? I think the majority of Americans think that it's silly that we have more people in prison than any other country in the world over pot laws. We have about a half a minute left here. Jacob Sullum from Reason Magazine. What's your argument? What's the pitch? How do we change this?
Well, I think you first have to recognize all the horrible consequences that follow from trying to stop people from getting these substances that they want. And what you were talking about before, what's going on in Mexico, the way all these other countries are suffering in addition to our own country in terms of the violence and the corruption and the disorder. This is all a result not of drug use itself, but of prohibition. This is all prohibition related, very predictable result of prohibition. Yeah. So the question is, does prohibition clearly has really horrible side effects, are those justified by what it accomplishes? And of course, my argument is that whatever good it does, it doesn't nearly outweigh all the tremendous damage.
Yeah, no, I'm in agreement with that. It's rare that I agree with a libertarian, but I guess on the smoke dope and get laid part, Jacob Sullum, Reason.com. Hey, Jacob, thanks for being on.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work. Reason.com, Reason.org, and Reason.com. By the way, the two websites.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.